Hello everyone, welcome to our training for today. I am your instructor, which is El Tortula, and I am going to share with you the assessment tools of early childhood education, specifically in diagnostic, summative, and formative assessments. I hope that you have your module with you and open it on page 29 so that you can follow everything that I am going to discuss with you today. So this would be the title of our Module 2, Assessment Tools of Early Childhood Education. And our lesson is about, as I've said, it's about the diagnostic, summative, and formative assessments. So our learning outcome for this module is to use various assessment tools to observe young children. And at the end of the lesson, you are expected to define diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment. Then describe the purpose of diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment. Lastly, explain the advantages and disadvantages of diagnostic, summative, and formative assessment. But before we proceed to the discussion, let's try to answer the activate part. And here's the instruction. You are going to provide 3 samples of diagnostic, summative, and formative assessment, which you have utilized in class. Then, paste your samples in the space provided below. So here, as you can see, there are boxes below I have provided. So to make it clear, 3 samples, just 3 samples, 1 for diagnostic, 1 for summative, and another one for formative assessment. Okay? Now, if you're done with the activate part, now let's proceed to acquire part. Let's define diagnostic assessment. Diagnostic assessment is a form of pre-assessment or before the lesson, where teachers can evaluate learners' strengths, weaknesses, knowledge, and skills before their instruction. So before the teacher is going to conduct the lesson, then the teacher may provide some diagnostic assessment in order for the teacher to evaluate first the child before conducting the lesson. Para malalaman po ng guro kung anong level na ng bata or the knowledge of that certain child for their lesson. So, teachers can plan meaningful and efficient instruction and can provide learners with an individualized learning experience. So, after the diagnostic assessment, the teacher may provide meaningful and efficient instruction based on the need of the child and based on the results of the diagnostic assessment. So, diagnostic assessment is a tool for teachers to better understand and what learners already know about a certain topic when submitted before the start of the course. Meaning to say, through assessment, the teacher will understand better the child. The teacher will know about his or her prior knowledge about the topic before the teacher will conduct all the lessons in that certain course. Okay, now these are the purpose of diagnostic assessment. So a diagnostic assessment refers to assignment written at the beginning and end of the course. Post-course assessment can be compared with pre-course assessment. So, kanang pre-course assessment, that is the diagnostic assessment. So, before the instruction. Then, after the instruction, the teacher will compare the potential improvement of the child in a certain areas. So, malalaman na po ng guro kung meron bang natutunan ang bata pagkatapos ng kanyang mga tinuturo. Okay, so this assessment allow the teacher to adjust the curriculum to meet the needs of current and future learners. So, diagnostic assessment are small-scale tests, usually one-on-one. Especially for the young children, we conduct assessment one-on-one with the purpose to gather specific data to help plan a child's specific learning plan. So kung conduct tayo ng diagnostic assessment, malalaman na natin ang level ng bata before we conduct our instruction. And then we will know what is the best strategy, what's the best lesson of the child based on his or her level. Now, this would be the advantages of diagnostic assessment. So I will just read list 3 and then you read the details in your module page 32. So here, as what I've said, diagnostic assessment may help the teacher know the learner's prior knowledge. And then it would also help the teacher in the teaching learning process. And then it can also help the teacher point out the gap on the learner's reasoning and perceptions about subject matter. So, in other words, assessment may help the teacher understand better about the child. So, importante na malalaman natin ang about sa ating mga estudyante para malalaman natin kung ano ang dapat natin gawin to help them improve and to help them learn. So these are some disadvantages of diagnostic assessment. So here, it can cause anxiety for learners who are unaware of this assessment. So this is just a diagnostic assessment and it does not define a certain student or a certain child. It doesn't mean kung mababa lang ang kanyang nakukuha, bobo siya, no. But it is just a basis for the teacher if how is she going to provide instruction for the child. Ano ang mga kailangan niyang matutunan, ano ang kanyang matutunan na, o ano ang dapat gawin ng guro through the diagnostic assessment. Pero for those students who doesn't know the purpose of diagnostic assessment, especially for the parents, it may cause anxiety. So, importante po mga teachers na importante na malalaman ng mga parents na diagnostic assessment is just to test the prior knowledge of their child. Hindi po mababagsak ang kanilang mga anak if they fail this assessment. So, another disadvantage is it is time consuming, no? Kasi we have to conduct the diagnostic first. So it may be time consuming, but I'm very sure that it's worth it. This may not be true assessment. Hindi daw lahat ay totoo. Okay, now this is the sample of diagnostic assessment for kindergarten. So as you can see, this is the kindergarten screening or diagnostic assessment. The child will identify the following letters. The teacher may say, okay, circle the letter R, and then identify the following numbers. So here, this is just an example. Okay, now let's proceed to formative assessment. Formative assessment is generally carried out throughout a course or project. In an educational setting, formative assessment is used by teachers to consider approaches to teaching and next steps for individual learners and the class, and it would not necessarily be used for grading purposes. So, formative assessment happened after the discussion or after the teacher discussed with a certain lesson. Then the teacher will conduct a formative assessment or a quiz. And then she will identify if the students have understand or not with the lesson. So that's why formative assessment may not be necessarily used for grading purposes. Pwedeng i-record, pwedeng hindi. This would be the basis if the teacher is going to teach the lesson based on the results of the formative assessment, or proceed to the next lesson if they can already if they have already met with the standards or with the objectives. Kung nasabta na nila, then the teacher may proceed to the next lesson. But if not, then the teacher may reteach the lesson or may provide more engaging activities for the learners to help them understand better. So that is formative assessment. Formative assessment also referred to as assessment for learning is used to aid learning. Okay, to aid learning. Katambalan ang learning. Assessment for learning is defined as all those activities undertaken teachers or learners which provide information to be used as feedback. So, kanina, aid for learning, and it could also be used as feedback. A feedback for the teacher if she is going to modify the teaching or provide learning activities in which they are engaged. So that is just a feedback. You may record or you may not record the results of the test or the quiz in this type of assessment, because this is just to help the learners learn or to give feedback for the teacher. Okay, now this is the purpose of formative assessment. Used by the teacher to qualitatively evaluate pupil understanding, learning needs, and their curriculum journey during the lesson or unit. The purpose of formative assessment is to improve teaching and it is happening. So this would be the advantages of formative assessment. As I've said before, it would be the aid for learning and help the teacher feedback. So first is to help identify what learners can do with and what they can do independently. Participating in formative assessment involves learners in active learning, keeps them on track, and focuses them on learning goals. So just read the advantages and disadvantages of formative assessment on page 34. Okay, now let's proceed to summative assessment. Summative assessment is assessment administered at the end of the instruction, at the end of the instructional unit. So these assessments are intended to evaluate children's learning by comparing performance to a standard. They are often high stakes or mga high point value. Like in your module, our summative assessment is equivalent to our major performance output. So, kanang inyong major performance output, that is equivalent as your summative assessment. Equivalent for midterm and final exam for the college students. So that's why I would like to encourage everyone to please do your part, to do your best in complying the major performance output. We only have 3. For the first module, we have the explainer video. So you do your best because, as I've said, that is your summative assessment. That would evaluate your performance to a certain standard. So I will know if you have met the standards or not based on your performance. Okay, now these are the purposes of summative assessment. It would help the learners used to certify what the learners know, can do, and level of their proficiency, mastery, or competency at the end of the course, unit, chapter, grading, period, or semester. Just like you, it would test your knowledge in a certain module or chapter. An example of summative assessment, we have here unit test, chapter test, long test, quarter exams, midterm exams, and final exams. So through summative assessment, it will reveal whether the instructions have successfully achieved or not. So in ana siya no, it's a higher point value compared to the formative assessment and diagnostic assessment. Now let's try to compare the difference between formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment is ongoing, flexible, and more informal diagnostic tool, while summative assessment, as the word implies, evaluation of the sum product of the lesson. So the evaluation of all the lessons in a certain chapter or units. That's why it's more higher value compared to the formative assessment. Because an example of a formative assessment is like quiz after the lesson. It may be recorded or not recorded based on the result. Formative assessment is just a basis for the teacher or feedback for the teacher if they have already understand or not. So 10-item test can be a formative assessment, but a 10-item test cannot be a summative assessment. Okay, mas formal, mas taas, mas higher value ang summative assessment. Examples of summative assessment like written assessment, and then for the children, written assessment, they have their writing their names and letters. Performance assessment, like the child will have a singing contest, storytelling, poem contest. So performance assessment, from the word performance, then the child will be required to do an activity or to showcase their activity. Just like you have your major performance assessment. So you have to do something. That's why you have to do your explainer video, and you show your creativity in answering questions through video presentation, through an explainer video. Diba? So another assessment, an example for summative assessment is the standardized assessment. Itong mga national achievement test, itong mga formal ng mga test coming from the national standardized test, like entrance exam is an example of a standardized test. So this the learners will take exam created or given curriculum, and it will be measured against existing rubric shared with the learners throughout the course. And last example for summative assessment, we have oral assessment. The learners will craft and deliver an oral piece, such as speech or presentation. It's quite related with the performance assessment, right? Okay, so I think we're done with the 3 types of assessment. We have the diagnostic assessment. It happens before the instruction. And then formative assessment, it happens after the discussion, and it's just a basis for a feedback for the teacher if they have understand the lesson or not, and then that would help the teacher decide to do something if she is going to reteach the lesson or to provide more engaging activities for the learners. And for the summative assessment, it is a kind of assessment where the teachers will evaluate a certain the knowledge of the students based on the knowledge of the students in that period or in that chapter. So in that grading, that's why it's higher point value compared to the diagnostic and formative assessment. Sabtan ba ninyo mga teachers? So I hope you have understand the meaning and the advantages and the disadvantages and the purposes of these type of assessment. Okay? Now, we're done discussing. Let's proceed to the assess part. So here you are going to fill in the matrix below. So I have already written there the type of assessment. The first is the diagnostic, second is the formative, and the third is the summative assessment. Write the definition. Do not copy what is written above. Just write it in your own words, based on your understanding, based on also in our lesson, but do not just copy and paste, okay? And then when are we going to use this assessment? Diba? Sa diagnostic, before the instruction. Sa formative, after the discussion. Or it may be flexible. Summative assessment is after a certain period of time, or after the lesson, after the chapter, the lesson. Okay, and then write also the advantages, 3 disadvantages, and 3 disadvantages per type of assessment. Okay, so here's the rubric for the matrix. It is found on page 37, so that would be the basis of your grades based in your activity. So I think we're done. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've learned something for today. Thank you, and God bless.